"You can have a wedding anytime, Abby. This is my first baby." She said it without blinking. No guilt, no hesitation. That's what my sister said 8 weeks before I walked down the aisle in a garden full of empty chairs. She said it like she was choosing between brunch spots, like my wedding day was something I could reschedule around her convenience. So she booked her baby shower on the same day, same hour, and one by one my entire family followed her. My mom, my aunts, my cousins, even my dad, the man who held my hands and promised he'd walk me down the aisle. He chose finger sandwiches at a country club over his own daughter's vows. 9 people showed up to my wedding. 503 messages showed up the moment they realized what they'd missed. Before I go on, if this story hits close to home, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and your local time. My name is Abigail Prescott. I'm 29. And now let me take you back to 5 months before my wedding to the Thanksgiving dinner where my father looked my husband in the eye and told him he'd never amount to anything. My father, Robert, spent 33 years managing a regional bank in Hanover. He was steady, predictable, the kind of man who wore the same 3 gray ties on rotation and proudly called it discipline. My mother, Donna, was the architect of our public image. She stayed home, hosted flawless book clubs, and made sure our house in Georgetown always looked like it belonged in a magazine. White colonial, black shutters, perfectly trimmed hydrangeas lining the brick walkway. From the street, we were a beautiful postcard. But inside, the math of our love was deeply broken. 4 years ago, Chloe married Blake Winchester. The Winchesters owned a massive commercial real estate firm in Franklin County, or at least they used to. Back then, Blake was the ultimate golden boy. He bought Chloe a heavy Lincoln SUV, clasped a diamond Chopard bracelet around her wrist, and most importantly, he bought my parents. Completely. Blake paid the thick monthly mortgage on that perfect Georgetown house. He handed my mother a platinum credit card for her personal expenses. He funded their glittering new kitchen renovation. In return, the entire Prescott family treated my sister like absolute royalty. Chloe hasn't worked a single day in 7 years. She calls herself a socialite and an event planner, though I've never seen her plan anything but her own luxury vacations. In my family's eyes, marrying a rich man was exactly the same as actually achieving something. And then there was me, Abigail, the younger daughter, the shadow. I scraped by as a freelance illustrator, drawing children's books and editorial art. It was the kind of messy, quiet work that doesn't come with a shiny corner office or a title to brag about at parties. I lived in a drafty, rented studio in Newport. My countertops were permanently stained with ink, and my bed was a second-hand couch that creaked every time I turned. I never hated Chloe for having money. I hated that her money made my parents forget I was even alive. 2 years ago, everything shifted. I met Mason Donovan at a cramped art fair by the Newport docks. He was standing in front of his own painting, a large oil canvas of a woman reading on a Boston fire escape, the golden hour light hitting her hair perfectly. He was frowning at his masterpiece like it had deeply offended him. I couldn't help it. I laughed. He turned around. Something in his dark eyes, a quiet burning intensity, made my breath catch in my throat. Mason was a contemporary realist painter. He had the kind of raw, staggering talent that gallery owners whispered about. My family, of course, just called it a hobby. He took small commissions when they came. Some months we felt rich. Other months we ate plain pasta for a week straight. But we were building something real, something honest, that mattered more to me than any bank account. Thanksgiving, 7 months before our wedding, I brought Mason home to the Georgetown house for dinner. Chloe made her grand entrance in the Lincoln, carrying 2 bottles of Sonoma Valley Cabernet. $250 a bottle, she announced instantly. I had spent 6 hours baking a cherry pie from scratch. My mother took Chloe's wine with both hands, treating it like a holy artifact. She didn't even look at my pie. Over the dry turkey, my father leaned toward Mason. He wore his fake, polite smile, the one he used right before rejecting someone's loan. "So Mason," my father said, the room going dead silent, "when are you going to give up and get a real job?" Blake snickered from across the table. Chloe tilted her head, her voice dripping with toxic pity. "Well, at least Abigail finally has someone, right?" Mason didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just reached under the heavy wooden table and gripped my trembling hand, his thumb stroking my knuckles. He was my safe place. But as we sat there absorbing their cruelty, I had no idea that a single buzzing cell phone was about to expose the first cracked brick in my sister's perfect kingdom. Right before dessert, a harsh buzz cut through the clinking silverware. Blake's phone. He glanced at the glowing screen and all the warm color instantly drained from his face. He shot up from his chair, rushing out into the dim hallway. Something is terribly wrong. I leaned slightly in my seat, straining to hear. You can't pull the funding now. We're leveraged to the roof, he hissed into the receiver. His golden boy posture totally collapsed, replaced by sheer breathless panic. His hands, usually so confident and steady, were trembling wildly against the wall. I glanced back at the dining room table. My parents were completely blind to it. They were too busy worshipping the shiny illusion of his wealth to see the heavy kingdom crumbling right in front of their eyes. What none of them knew, what even I barely grasped at the time, was that our own quiet world was shifting too. Mason had just finished a massive, breathtaking painting for a mysterious new client. Our landlord, Henry, had made the introduction. I hadn't asked many questions because I was too wrapped up in simple survival. But that single wet canvas was about to rewrite our entire lives. Henry Bancroft was a ghost of a man. If you weren't paying close attention, you'd walk right past him on the street. 68, silver-haired, always wrapped in a faded corduroy jacket. He drank bitter black coffee from a chipped mug that read Tribeca NYC. He owned our building, the Old Georgian in Newport. We paid just $950 a month for a huge ground-floor studio with soaring 14-foot ceilings and stunning north-facing light. It was a miracle price. Once I asked him why he practically gave the space away. He just smiled softly, his eyes crinkling. I'd rather have artists breathing life into my building than accountants. No offense to accountants. To me, Henry was just a sweet, retired guy who brought us fresh garden tomatoes in the humid August heat and forgave a late rent check without a single complaint. But Henry had a habit of drifting downstairs. He would stand silently behind Mason's easel, steam rising from his mug. The light on the jawline, he'd murmur. Push it warmer. Just a quarter degree. Mason would obey, adding a single brushstroke, and the whole portrait would suddenly spark to life. He sees things no one else does. One rainy afternoon, Henry casually dropped a comment I almost ignored. Your work reminds me of a boy I used to represent, he told Mason. He sells for 7 figures now. I smiled politely, thinking he was just being a kind, generous old man. Soon after, Henry asked Mason to photograph some recent pieces for a friend. I figured it was a tiny local gallery, maybe a regional buyer looking for a bargain. The world has a funny way of finding real talent, Abigail. Henry whispered to me one night as I washed heavy paintbrushes in the rusted sink. It just takes a little longer when you refuse to fake it. I should have demanded more details. I should have paid closer attention, but my mind was already spinning with wedding plans. January came, bringing a bitter, freezing snowstorm. Mason proposed. There was no diamond ring, no grand theatrical speech. Just a soft, breathless question asked while we lay tangled on the cold studio floor, surrounded by the sharp smell of turpentine and half-finished dreams, watching the heavy snow bury the street outside. Later, he carved a band out of warm, reclaimed walnut wood. I slid it onto my finger, and I had never felt wealthier. That weekend, with my heart racing, I called my parents. I told them we picked a date, May 12th, a tiny garden ceremony in Delaware. Just 48 guests, wild daisies, and an arch-mason was building from scrap wood. My father's very first words were not congratulations, not I'm so happy for my little girl. He sighed heavily into the receiver. May 12th. Let me check my calendar. Let me check. 3 agonizing days passed before he finally called back. I'll be there, sweetheart. I'll walk you down the aisle. I promise. I held those fragile words tightly against my chest like spun glass, terrified they would shatter. My mother was even colder. That's nice, honey. How much is it costing us? Not a word about my vintage dress. Not a single question about my happiness. And Chloe, she sent one pathetic text message. Congrats. Let me know if you need help. Then total silence. No phone calls. No cake tasting. My sister, the self-proclaimed event planner, completely vanished. Her silence wasn't just selfish, it was a calculated, ticking time bomb, and I had no idea she had already lit the fuse. Mason and I built our dream with our bare hands. I sat at my drafting table late into the night, carefully hand-painting every single invitation, delicate watercolor wildflowers bleeding onto thick cream cardstock. Each one was unique, painted with desperate, quiet hope. I remembered Chloe's wedding 4 years prior. 350 guests, heavy gold foil, a loud 10-piece band. But I absolutely adored our simple invitations. They held our actual fingerprints. They were ours. I should have felt the danger approaching when Chloe didn't argue about my chosen date. She always had a sharp, cutting opinion about everything I did. But this time, absolute silence. And in my family, silence from my sister was never peace. It was a predator circling in the tall grass. 4 weeks before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my phone rang. Aunt Penelope, My mother's older sister and the family's designated gossip shattered my world with a single breath. Honey, are you going to Chloe's shower too, or just the wedding? They're the same day, right? I froze in the cramped kitchen. My hand went limp. Bright turquoise paint dripped off my brush, splattering onto the worn floorboards like a tiny tragic puddle. What shower? I managed to choke out. The baby shower. May 12th, at the club in Glendale. Didn't you get the fancy invitation? I had not. But a second later Penelope texted me a picture of it. My heart slammed against my ribs, then completely stopped. It wasn't just a piece of thick paper. The background was a soft hand-painted watercolor of a sleeping baby fawn. My watercolor. The exact one I had painstakingly painted for my portfolio a year ago. Chloe hadn't just hijacked my date. She had digitally stolen my personal artwork, mercilessly cropped out my signature, and used it for the exact event designed to destroy my wedding day. I called my sister, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright, sugary, and perfectly rehearsed. Oh my God, Abby. I didn't realize the venue Blake booked only had May 12th open. It's a massive headache with the caterer and rental company. I simply can't move it now. But your wedding is late afternoon, right? Maybe people can just do both. My ceremony was at 4 o'clock in Milford. Her lavish shower was at 1 o'clock in Glendale, 2 agonizing hours apart. No one could do both. The laws of time and geography knew it. I knew it. She knew it. The shower was at the elite Glendale Country Club, featuring valet parking, a gourmet French menu from Springfield, and custom monogrammed gift bags. She rattled off these details as if describing a natural disaster that couldn't be avoided, but a heavy stone of dread settled deep in my stomach. Penelope had confirmed Chloe mailed those stolen invitations 3 weeks before I mailed my save the dates. 3 weeks. She had known my date for months, and she chose it anyway. Abby, I'm so sorry, Chloe cooed, her tone dripping with sweet poison. But this is my very first baby. You understand, right? You can have a wedding anytime. I dialed my mother, gasping for air. Mom, she stole my artwork. She literally stole it to ruin my day. A long, crushing pause filled the line, the kind of terrible silence that already contains the final verdict. I know, honey, my mother sighed, but Chloe really needs the family there to support her. It's the first grandchild. And honestly, Abigail, please don't be petty. Are you actually going to charge your pregnant sister for a silly little drawing? Can't you just postpone your party a few weeks? I've paid non-refundable deposits, Mom. The invitations are sent. Well, maybe not everyone needs to be at both, she reasoned coldly. I'm sure some people will show up to yours. Some people, like my wedding was a pathetic open mic night hoping for a few bored stragglers. I called my father next, praying for a hero. He did what Robert Prescott always does when forced to face reality. He cowardly deflected. Let me talk to your mother. We'll figure it out. He ghosted me for 4 agonizing days. I texted him, Dad, are you still walking me down the aisle? I watched the blue check mark appear. Read. Ignored. I called frantically. On the 3rd try he finally picked up. Of course, sweetheart. I said I would. But the sheer hollowness in his throat, the robotic way he delivered the words, I felt the earth crack completely beneath my feet. But Chloe wasn't finished. She wanted total annihilation. 3 weeks before the big day she sent her favorite flying monkey. Cousin Eleanor practically kicked open our studio door, a vicious fake smile plastered across her face. She looked at Mason's paint-splattered jeans and audibly sneered. You know, Abby, Chloe is just so incredibly stressed about her beautiful shower. It would be so much easier for everyone if you just rescheduled. Eleanor's sharp eyes darted aggressively toward my open wedding planning binder on the table. Besides, didn't your caterer just cancel? My blood instantly turned to ice. My lungs seized. How did you know that? I whispered. Eleanor smirked, leaning in close to deliver the killing blow. Chloe needed a high-end French menu for Glendale. She just offered them triple what you were paying. Business is business, right? You guys couldn't afford them anyway. I stood there, utterly paralyzed, gasping for oxygen in my own home. My own flesh and blood had systematically, financially sabotaged the happiest day of my life, just to guarantee I had absolutely nothing left. And the worst part? The family had already secretly voted on who they were going to support, and the brutal truth of their betrayal was worse than I could ever imagine. That same week, I sat alone at my tiny kitchen table, staring blankly at a neat stack of return envelopes. I counted the RSVPs one by one. Out of 44 invited family members, 26 had already responded with a harsh, glaring no. Every single one of them, by some cruel miracle, was suddenly attending the Glendale Country Club instead. I didn't cry. I didn't pick up the phone to beg for their love. If I have to convince you to care about me, you already don't. I asked them clearly, just once. I told myself their final answer. The real truth spoken through awkward logistics and whispered excuses would reveal everything I needed to know about my exact place in their world. It absolutely did. It took Rebecca, my fierce best friend, to drag the ugly hidden reality into the light. Rebecca is a trauma nurse. She deals with bleeding wounds every day, and she takes zero nonsense from anyone. She had been trapped in the giant Prescott family group chat for years, a forgotten ghost from my college days. Nobody ever bothered to remove her. And because Rebecca loves me fiercely, she secretly screenshotted every single word. She marched into my studio that evening, her face stormy, and sat me down on the edge of the futon. She laid her glowing phone in my lap like a loaded weapon. Chloe hadn't just mailed out pretty invitations. She had executed a surgical, military-level strike. My sister called every single relative individually. To my mother, Chloe wept crocodile tears. "Mom, if you go to Abigail's little garden party instead, I'll know you don't care about your very first grandchild." To Aunt Penelope, she used social terror. "Blake's wealthy mother is coming. If our side doesn't show up in full force, it will look completely humiliating for us." And to my father, Rebecca swiped to a fresh image. My stomach violently pitched. Chloe had typed, "Dad, just tell Abigail you can't make it. She will understand. She's used to being disappointed." She's used to being disappointed. My own flesh and blood. She typed those exact letters with her thumbs and carelessly pressed send. But the absolute deepest, sickest cut was the financial reality. Blake quietly paid my parents' massive mortgage, $3,800 a month. He handed my mother a platinum card that covered her fancy groceries, expensive salon visits, and designer clothes. The Prescott family wasn't just emotionally blinded by Chloe. They were kept on a tight, gold-plated leash. Chloe never said the threat out loud. She didn't have to. The heavy implication hung over every holiday dinner. "If you cross me, the cash flow stops instantly." My parents had built their entire cozy retirement around Blake's wallet. They simply couldn't afford to love me. It wasn't just a quiet, polite rejection. Rebecca forced me to read the toxic, hidden back channels. Aunt Penelope's message burned my eyes. "I feel bad for Abby, but Chloe says Blake's key investors will be at the shower. We have to show family solidarity to keep the business looking strong." Uncle Tim quickly replied, "Exactly. Mason's just a starving artist anyway. Abby will get over it." They weren't just choosing a baby over a bride. They were doing cold, hard math. They calculated the return on investment for their physical presence. I was a worthless, crashing stock. Chloe was a guaranteed blue-chip payout. In the main group chat, Rebecca showed me one final devastating message from my sister. "Honestly, guys, Abigail's wedding is so tiny, it's barely an actual event. She's marrying a broke painter in some random garden. It's not like she's hosting a reception at the Waldorf." I read those venomous words twice. My vision blurred. I slowly closed the phone, plunging the screen into absolute darkness. My family had officially priced my worth and sold me out for a country club buffet. But as I looked across the dimly lit studio at Mason, a dangerous, quiet fire finally ignited in my chest. The weeping, pathetic sister was gone, and what I was about to do next would force them to stare directly at the wreckage they had caused. The night before I sent the final, ultimate reminder to my family, Mason and I sat quietly together in our dim studio. The overhead lamp cast a warm, buttery yellow glow across half-finished canvases and glass jars of cloudy turpentine. Outside, the summer cicadas were already starting up. Summer in Newport always sounds like a low, vibrating hum that never truly stops. Mason was carefully cleaning his bristles. He didn't even look up when he finally spoke. "We don't need them to make this real, Abigail." A heavy, tender pause hung in the air. "But I know you want your dad there." I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I was staring blankly at the canvas he had been working on all week. It was a painting of a lone wooden chair in a completely empty room. Stark white light pouring through a dirty window. It wasn't meant to be about me, but my heart ached looking at it. He paints the loneliness I can't speak aloud. That night I composed one final message. A massive group text to every single relative who had been formally invited. I stripped out all the emotion. No guilt trips, no desperate begging, no tears. Just the cold, hard facts. Date, time, address, driving directions, and at the very bottom, one simple line. "I hope to see you there." I pressed send at 11:15 p.m. I watched the little delivery bubbles pop up on the screen. Then, I waited. And waited. Not a single person replied. The digital silence was deafening. The next morning, Rebecca called me from Cleveland. She was already at the airport, her boarding pass in hand. "I'll be there. she said fiercely over the background noise of the terminal. "I will always be there." She didn't bother asking about my parents or my sister. She already knew the brutal math. May 12th was suddenly 15 days away. I had a dress hanging carefully in my narrow closet, a swath of vintage ivory lace I found buried in a consignment shop. A kind local seamstress had altered it to fit my frame for just $95, whispering that I looked exactly like Grace Kelly. I had wild peonies ordered from a dusty roadside farm. I had 48 wooden chairs rented for a grassy lawn. What I didn't have was a single blood relative who chose me. But I also didn't have the urge to beg anymore. And that, I realized, was the very first time I felt the tectonic plates of my soul actually shift. May 12th, 6:30 a.m., the morning of my wedding. Rebecca was sitting cross-legged on my bathroom counter, expertly applying my makeup. She called it hospital-grade precision, trying to make me laugh while I struggled to breathe normally. My beautiful thrift store dress hung on the closet door. My bouquet sat cheerfully in a mason jar on the kitchen counter. Suddenly my phone vibrated against the hard porcelain sink. "Dad." I slowly picked it up. Rebecca completely froze, watching my pale face. "Abigail, honey," his voice crackled through the speaker. It sounded utterly defeated, sanded down to absolute nothingness. "I don't know how to say this to you. Your mother and I, well, Chloe's shower starts at 1 o'clock. And with the long drive, I just don't think we can make it to Milford by 4. 8 seconds. I counted them in my head. 1, 2, 3. Those 8 seconds of agonizing silence were the entire collapsing architecture of my childhood. Every handmade Father's Day card. Every desperate daddy, look what I drew. Every foolish time I chose to believe he loved his daughters equally. It all crashed down like a fragile house built on wet sand. "You promised, Dad." "I know I did. And I'm so sorry, but this is Chloe's first baby. You'll have other special moments." "No," I replied. My voice didn't shake. "To this day, I am profoundly proud of that. This is my only wedding day, Dad. There won't ever be another one. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I hung up the phone. I set it face down on the counter. My cold hands were trembling violently, but my eyes were bone dry. I am an orphan with living parents. Rebecca didn't say a single word of pity. She just picked up the mascara wand, tilted my chin up, and fiercely kept going. A few hours later, Rebecca casually checked her Instagram. She gasped softly and turned the screen around for me to see. Chloe had already posted a live story. Giant pink balloons, glittering gold streamers, an elite country club patio being decorated by hired staff. The cheerful caption read, "So grateful to have the whole family here today." It was posted at 9 a.m., 4 hours before her shower even started. She wasn't celebrating a baby. She was planting a flag. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just stared at the glowing photo and thought, so this is exactly what it feels like when the very last thread permanently snaps. I had somehow survived the crushing morning, but walking down that long empty aisle completely alone was a different kind of terror entirely, and a quiet, unexpected shadow was about to step out of the background to change my life forever. The Milford Garden venue was tucked quietly behind a small inn, overlooking a wild salt marsh. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, the calm water turned a brilliant metallic silver. Mason had vanished for 2 whole weekends to build our wedding arch. He crafted it from heavy salvaged oak, sanding the rough wood perfectly smooth, and draping it with fragrant eucalyptus branches and crisp white ribbons. It wasn't a grand cathedral, but it was breathtaking. It was ours. I pulled up at 3:15 p.m. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The seating was already arranged on the soft grass. 48 pristine white linen chairs, sitting in perfectly straight rows. On the back of every single seat, Mason had tied a fresh sprig of purple lavender. From a distance it looked like a beautiful painted masterpiece. But as I walked closer, the crushing reality hit me. 39 of those beautiful chairs were completely empty. Just 9 people came. 9. Mason, my fierce best friend Rebecca, 2 of Mason's old art school buddies, a quiet sculptor named Dan, and a talented printmaker named Leah. 4 loyal girls from my college days who had driven hours down from New York. And finally, Henry Bancroft, standing near the back in a sharp suit I had never seen him wear before. That was it. 9 beating hearts. A chilly afternoon breeze swept through the vacant rows, rustling the dry lavender as if trying desperately to fill the heavy, suffocating silence. I stood frozen at the beginning of the grassy aisle. My vintage ivory lace dress hugged my waist perfectly. The seamstress was right. It looked like it was spun just for me. But standing there all alone, without a warm hand to hold, without my father waiting proudly by my side to give me away, I felt the weight of every single empty seat. They ached like dark purple bruises on my skin. A tiny string quartet, just 2 college girls with a violin and a cello, started to play Pachelbel's Canon. The sweet weeping music floated out over the vast salt marsh. Rebecca stepped toward me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I can walk you down," she whispered fiercely. I slowly shook my head. "No, you're my maid of honor. You belong up there with Mason." I turned to face the long, terrifying path. Mason stood at the far end. Even from a distance I could see his dark eyes were bright red. He was crying for me. I took a deep, shaky breath, preparing to take the very first step entirely alone. Then, I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching on the grass right behind me. I believe I am terribly overdressed for a simple garden party. I spun around. Henry Bancroft stood just 3 feet away. He wore a stunning vintage navy 3-piece suit that was beautifully tailored and clearly treasured. A pale blue pocket square rested against his chest, and heavy silver cufflinks caught the golden sunlight. Much later, I would notice the tiny engraving on them, B.B. Bancroft Gallery. But right in that fragile moment, all I could see was the fierce, unwavering steadiness in his old eyes. "But if you would let an old man have the greatest honor," he said softly, extending his bent arm toward me. Something massive finally broke open deep inside my chest. It wasn't the sharp, agonizing kind of breaking. It was the kind where warm light finally pours into a dark room. I stared at this quiet man, our landlord, our downstairs neighbor, the guy who drank bitter coffee and told Mason to push the painted shadows warmer. I suddenly realized Henry hadn't just been kind. He had been watching. He had been paying attention to our struggle. While my own blood abandoned me, he actually showed up. "Henry, you really don't have to do this," I choked out, tears spilling hot down my cheeks. "I know I don't have to." His voice was calm and absolute. "I want to. Your father should be standing right here. But since he isn't, someone who actually knows your true value should be." I gripped his strong arm. We walked. As we moved past the empty rows, the 9 precious people sitting in those chairs immediately stood up. Rebecca was already sobbing openly. Dan and Leah beamed with massive smiles. At the end of the grassy aisle, Mason pressed the back of his trembling hand hard against his mouth. The actual ceremony only lasted 15 minutes. A retired judge, who Mason knew from a local community art project, kept the words short and deeply meaningful. Then came our vows. Mason had written his promises on a ragged piece of thick canvas primed in white gesso. I had written mine on the back of a failed ink-stained illustration. We both cried. We both laughed out loud. 9 people clapped until their hands hurt. And standing in that breezy garden on that beautiful May afternoon, it was enough. It was more than enough. I will never forget that moment. If Henry stepping in makes your chest tighten the way mine did that day, you already understand why this specific memory matters so much. My father had 33 long years to prove he loved me. Henry had only known me for 2, but he was exactly where I needed him to be. When family leaves a gaping hole, sometimes the universe sends a stranger to fill it. After the vows, we didn't drive to a fancy ballroom. There was no flashing DJ, no ridiculous 4-tier fondant cake. We threw our reception right there on the lawn. We ordered a massive stack of pizzas from a greasy joint in downtown Milford. It was the ultimate bitter irony. Chloe had maliciously stolen my expensive French caterer, but sitting on the grass, eating hot pepperoni pizza right out of a cardboard box in my wedding dress felt infinitely more honest. Rebecca brought 4 bottles of cheap, delicious red wine. Dan synced his phone to a tiny portable speaker. We kicked off our shoes and danced wildly on the damp grass until the yellow fireflies flickered to life in the dark. It was loud. It was gloriously imperfect. It was entirely ours. But eventually the music faded. Mason began helping Dan fold up the heavy wooden tables. I sat down on one of the cold, empty white chairs and pulled my phone out of my purse. 0 messages. Not a single text from my family. No congratulations, Abigail. No, we are so sorry we couldn't make the drive. No thinking of you on your special day. Nothing at all. It was as if my wedding had never existed. As if I had never existed. Against my better judgment, I opened Instagram. Chloe had uploaded 18 high-definition photos. The Glendale Country Club was dripping in massive pink and gold balloon arches. There was a towering dessert table that probably cost more than my entire wedding budget. I saw Aunt Penelope throwing her head back, laughing with a crystal glass of champagne, Uncle Tim clutching a monogrammed luxury gift bag. And then I saw my father. He was standing proudly right beside Chloe, his large hand resting gently on her pregnant belly, grinning from ear to ear. The very last photo in the carousel was a bright selfie. Chloe was glowing in the center, completely surrounded by the exact smiling faces I had invited to my wedding. Her typed caption read, "Surrounded by so much love today. Family is absolutely everything. Family is everything." She typed those words to her followers at the exact moment I was saying my sacred vows to 9 people and 39 empty chairs. I zoomed in closely on one of the blurry background images near the open bar. Blake was standing alone in the far dark corner. His back was turned away from the cheerful camera. His phone was pressed tightly to his ear, and his jaw was locked in rigid tension. He looked completely sick with stress. It struck me as very bizarre behavior for such a joyful celebration, but I was too exhausted to care. I mentally filed it away and closed the app. Late that night, back in our quiet Newport studio, Mason and I collapsed onto the lumpy old futon that doubled as our couch. The large windows were pushed wide open, and the rhythmic sound of chirping crickets poured inside like a lullaby. We had gathered the purple lavender from the ceremony chairs and stuffed the sprigs into glass jars all over the apartment. The whole room smelled like our wedding had followed us home. Mason stared up at the cracked ceiling, his warm hand securely gripping mine. "I married the absolute most talented, stubborn, beautiful woman I've ever met in my life," he whispered into the dark. "In a tiny garden, with only 9 witnesses. He rolled over to face me, his dark eyes fierce, and I wouldn't trade it for a grand ballroom packed with 350 people. I tried to smile back. I almost managed to fake it. I just keep thinking, maybe if I had tried a little harder. Maybe if I called Dad just one more time. "You called them enough." His voice was gentle, but carried a heavy final weight, like a thick iron door slamming shut on a room I no longer needed to visit. "You called them more than enough, Abigail." The tragic truth hit me right then. I wasn't feeling sad for myself anymore. I was heartbroken for him. Mason had stood at the end of that aisle, forced to watch his glowing bride walk toward him on the arm of a 68-year-old landlord, simply because her own flesh and blood couldn't be bothered to show up. He deserved a massive, cheering family. He deserved so much better than a sea of empty seats. "You deserved a real wedding," I choked out, a tear slipping into my hair, "with a family cheering loudly for us." "This was a real wedding," Mason replied fiercely, pulling me against his chest. "Henry was there. Rebecca was there. That's way more true family than your blood gave you today." I finally broke down, crying quietly into his cotton shirt. I didn't weep because I was shattered. I cried because I was simply so incredibly tired of trying to hold my broken family together all by myself. I fell asleep in his warm arms that night, completely unaware that Mason was hiding a massive, earth-shattering secret, something Henry had secretly helped him orchestrate over the last few months, something deliberately hidden so money wouldn't infect our pure wedding day, and something that was about to flip my family's arrogant world entirely upside down. A full week dragged by, then another. The silence from my family wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Not a single relative reached out. My phone was a complete ghost town. On the 9th day, I finally typed out one last message to the group chat. I crafted it carefully, reading the words 3 times until they blurred, and then I hit send. "Thank you for your loud silence. It told me everything your empty words never could. I won't be reaching out again. If you ever want to talk, you know exactly where to find me." 4 agonizing days later, my mother finally replied. Just 2 sentences. "Abigail, please don't be dramatic. We love you, but Chloe's shower was just bad timing. Dramatic, no real apology, no shred of accountability. Just that one poisoned word." It was the Prescott family's favorite, sharpened weapon against anyone who dared to feel things out loud. I didn't type a response. I didn't shed another tear. I simply muted the chat, tossed my phone into a dark drawer, and turned my entire soul toward the only thing that had never betrayed me, the work. Mason was painting again. He worked with a feverish, burning energy I had never witnessed before. He started a massive, breathtaking series he quietly titled The 9th Chair. They were large-format oil pieces exploring the haunting ache of absence in intimate spaces. One canvas showed a long, polished dining table set perfectly for 13 people, with one wooden chair slightly pulled back, completely untouched. Another featured a hollow church pew, empty except for a single folded program resting on the far edge. But the masterpiece was the 3rd canvas, a grassy garden lined with neat rows of white linen chairs, sprigs of purple lavender resting on the cushions, 39 of those seats holding absolutely nothing but cold air. I knew exactly what the shadows meant. He didn't need to explain the grief dripping from his brush. One rainy afternoon, Henry drifted downstairs to see the new progress. He stood completely frozen in front of the garden painting for a long time, his black coffee going entirely cold in his weathered hand. Without saying a word, he pulled out his cell phone and quickly typed a message. He didn't tell me who he was texting. I didn't bother to ask. I had completely stopped waiting for miracles that would never arrive, and I started focusing on building a quiet life that didn't need them. But the staggering truth was, without my knowledge, an enormous, life-altering foundation was already being poured beneath our feet, and it had our landlord's fingerprints all over it. 3 weeks after the wedding, Henry did something highly unusual. He formally invited Mason and me upstairs to his apartment for coffee. Not his usual casual stop by if the door is open, but a firm, serious invitation. When we walked in, he had set out 3 ceramic mugs, a steaming French press, and a heavy cardboard box resting in the center of his worn kitchen table. "Please sit down," he instructed softly. "There is something I really should have told you both a very long time ago." Henry slowly opened the dusty box. Inside were stacks of glossy exhibition catalogs from the legendary Bancroft Gallery in Tribeca, New York City. There were thick newspaper articles carefully clipped from Art in America and Apollo magazine. I saw crisp photographs of a much younger Henry standing proudly beside famous artists at elite gallery openings, people whose faces I instantly recognized from museum walls. "I ran the Bancroft Gallery for 24 years, Henry revealed, sliding a heavy catalog across the table toward me. The glossy cover displayed a famous painting I had literally studied in my college textbooks. I represented 47 brilliant artists during that golden era. 9 of them currently hang in the Guggenheim's permanent collection." I stared at him in pure shock. This was the quiet, invisible man in the faded corduroy jacket, the generous landlord who only charged us $950 a month and gently suggested Mason push his painted lighting slightly warmer. "You never told us," I breathed, completely stunned. "You never needed to know," Henry replied, folding his wrinkled hands. "I wanted to be absolutely sure about Mason's character first. I've spent my entire career learning the subtle difference between simply competent and truly extraordinary. Abigail, Mason is extraordinary." Then he dropped the earth-shattering news. 5 months earlier, long before Mason bought my wooden ring, before the wedding disaster, before any of the heartbreak, Henry had secretly sent high-resolution photographs of Mason's private work to a man named Vincent Atwood. Vincent Atwood was a legendary private billionaire collector whose vast holdings included priceless works by Rothko and Hopper. His intimidating name dominated every major auction catalog in the Western world. Vincent had purchased one of Mason's pieces immediately, for $95,000. My jaw physically dropped. I whipped my head to look at my husband. Mason nodded slowly, guilt and overwhelming relief washing across his face. "I was going to tell you the morning after the wedding," Mason whispered, squeezing my hand. "I swear, I just didn't want the shock of the money to overshadow our special day." But Vincent Atwood didn't just write massive checks blindly based on a few emailed photos. The week before the official paperwork arrived, our studio door banged open with terrifying force. Henry marched inside, followed closely by a tall, deeply intimidating man wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit, Vincent Atwood himself. No polite warning, no frantic time to clean up the dirty rags or hide Mason's messy sketchbooks. Vincent ignored me entirely, marching straight up to Mason's easel like a general inspecting a battlefield. He stared fiercely at the wet, glistening oil paint for 5 agonizing minutes in dead, suffocating silence. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt my throat. "Your underpainting is raw, visceral," Vincent finally barked, his piercing eyes darting from the canvas to Mason's face. "Are you brave enough to bleed on the canvas for 15 more pieces?" Mason didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He locked eyes with the terrifying billionaire and answered, "I'm already bleeding." Vincent smiled a shark-like grin. The massive deal was sealed in that exact, electrifying second. Over the next few dizzying days, the full, staggering scope of what Henry had set in motion became crystal clear. Vincent's elite New York attorney contacted Mason with a heavy, formal proposal. It was an exclusive art commission agreement for 15 original paintings, to be completed over the following 24 months, specifically for Vincent's private collection. The total contract value, $550,000. Every single legal term was flawlessly laid out. Payment milestones, intellectual property rights, premium transit insurance. It was the exact kind of golden contract that desperate artists spend their entire lives dreaming about but never actually see, and attached to the heavy legal packet was a separate, glowing letter from the director of the Camden Gallery on East 64th Street in Manhattan, one of the most fiercely respected galleries in the entire country. They were formally inviting Mason to headline a massive solo exhibition. The emotional centerpiece of the show would be the 9th Chair series. Mason and I drove to New York City to sign the final papers at the attorney's sleek Fifth Avenue office. I sat frozen in a plush leather chair, reading every single page twice. The dizzying numbers blurred in front of my eyes. My hands were shaking violently, but not from fear. "This is more money than my father earned in 7 years working at the bank," I whispered softly into the quiet room. Henry, who had proudly come along for the signing, placed his warm hand firmly on the glass table. "And it's only the very beginning, Abigail. Vincent doesn't just buy a product, he invests in a legacy. This will violently kick open every single door Mason ever walks toward." Mason confidently signed his name. The attorney swiftly stamped the seal. The Camden Gallery director confirmed the fast-approaching exhibition timeline via email that exact same afternoon. It was real, all of it. Heavily documented, beautifully legitimate, and legally binding. We hadn't breathed a word to anyone else. Not a single soul. My cruel family still firmly believed Mason was a pathetic loser who painted for fun and couldn't even pay his cheap rent without my freelance income. A week later, Vincent Atwood called Mason's cell phone directly. I was standing in the studio when Mason put the billionaire on speaker, not to show off, but because his hands were thickly coated in bright cadmium yellow paint. Vincent's deep voice was warm, rumbling, and completely unhurried, the specific tone of a powerful man who hasn't rushed for anything since 1997. "Mason, Henry tells me you and your lovely wife didn't exactly get the wedding trip you truly deserved," Vincent said smoothly. "My yacht, the Marina, is currently docked in Malta for the next month. I'd like you both to fly out and spend 12 days on board. Consider it a personal thank you for delivering the first 3 magnificent paintings so quickly. The Marina. I would learn later that it was a colossal, 160-foot luxury motor yacht that Vincent kept floating in the Mediterranean all summer long. He used it to lavishly host brilliant artists, famous curators, and elite collectors. It was essentially a floating billionaire's palace." "Mason, we absolutely can't accept that," I hissed, frantically covering the phone's microphone. He looked deeply at me, then back at his masterpiece on the easel. "Henry says Vincent does this for every single artist he commissions. It's how he builds his empire. It's strictly professional, Abby, not charity." I hesitated. A wave of old guilt washed over me, but then my mind flashed back to the grassy lawn, the 48 chairs, the empty garden, the father who coldly chose a country club buffet over his youngest daughter. I suddenly realized I had spent my entire existence making myself incredibly small, just so other people wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I was done shrinking. "Tell him yes," I whispered fiercely. Rebecca found out the thrilling news a few days later, and her reaction was absolutely priceless. "Girl, you are flying to Europe to sleep on a billionaire's mega yacht for your honeymoon, and your snobby family still thinks your husband is digging for pennies in the couch cushions." She laughed so hard she literally choked on her iced coffee. "They don't know a thing," I smiled softly, a deep peace settling in my bones. "And I'm not going to tell them." I wasn't trying to hide my joy. I had simply stopped performing a desperate song for a cruel audience that refused to clap, but while my family was busy writing me out of their wealthy fairy tale, they had absolutely no clue that a catastrophic financial storm was brewing right over their own heads, and it was about to wash their entire fake empire away. While Mason and I were busy packing our suitcases for the trip of a lifetime, the flawless Prescott facade was secretly beginning to shatter. I only caught tiny, jagged fragments of the disaster through Aunt Penelope. The family's favorite spy dropped vague, nervous hints in my messages. Blake Winchester's invincible real estate empire had struck a massive iceberg. 2 huge development projects had suddenly collapsed. Vital financing vanished overnight. The glittering Winchester name was quickly becoming toxic. The signs of ruin were everywhere if you knew where to look. Chloe's heavy, luxurious Lincoln SUV quietly disappeared from her driveway, abruptly swapped for a dusty used Honda. My sister, who treated Instagram like her own personal reality show, hadn't uploaded a single picture in 3 straight weeks. In Chloe's shallow, image-obsessed universe, that deafening digital silence was a screaming emergency flare. Then, for the first time in over a month, my phone rang. "Mom?" I hadn't heard her voice since she coldly ordered me to stop being petty about my stolen wedding date. "Hi, honey. How are you doing?" Her tone was painfully bright, stretched dangerously thin with fake cheer. "Listen, your father grilled steaks last weekend, and the weather was just lovely. We would absolutely adore having you and Mason over for Sunday dinner." I leaned hard against the studio wall, closing my eyes. The hypocrisy was physically nauseating. When Blake's deep pockets were overflowing with cash, I was completely invisible. Now that the Winchester gold mine was rapidly drying up, my parents were miraculously rediscovering their youngest daughter. "I'm busy, Mom," I answered flatly. She paused, clearly stunned that I didn't immediately jump at the pathetic crumb she offered. "Oh, well, your dad says hello." I hung up without another word. They had absolutely no idea that a few short weeks from now, Blake's missing money would look like pocket change. We flew out of New York on a humid Thursday morning. When we finally reached the bustling docks in Naples, Italy, I stood completely paralyzed. The marina wasn't just a boat. It was a staggering floating cathedral. Our private cabin featured cool marble floors, crisp Egyptian cotton sheets, and massive glass doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking water so vividly blue it looked painted. I stood on the polished teak deck that very first morning, barefoot, wearing a simple linen sundress I bought at a local street market. I watched the rugged coastline of Malta drift past, finally breathing clean, untainted air. The universe was finally catching up to us. On the fourth magical night, Vincent Atwood hosted a lavish, intimate dinner on the breezy upper deck. The guest list was deeply intimidating. 2 elite art collectors from Lisbon, a senior curator from the Louvre, a famous Brussels critic, and their elegant partners. The long table sparkled with heavy crystal and flickering hurricane candles. As the sky melted from fiery orange to deep indigo, Vincent stood up and tapped his glass. "I want to introduce Mason Donovan," the billionaire announced smoothly, his voice carrying over the ocean wind. "He is the most fiercely exciting realist painter I have encountered in 2 decades. His upcoming Camden Gallery show, The Ninth Chair, is going to be extraordinary." The elite table murmured in deep, genuine respect. Mason calmly explained the raw concept behind his empty chairs. The haunting ache of absence, the vacant spaces left behind by people who refused to show up. He spoke softly, without an ounce of arrogance. The Brussels critic leaned forward, his eyes wide with awe. "This incredible work has biennale potential," he declared fiercely. I sat there in the warm breeze, my hand resting securely on my husband's knee. For my entire life, my family mocked him as a pathetic failure. Here, surrounded by the absolute elite of the global art world, he was recognized as a brilliant master. Before dessert arrived, Vincent found me standing alone by the gleaming silver railing. "Your husband is profoundly gifted," he murmured, looking out at the dark waves. "But I think you already knew that long before anyone else bothered to look." I smiled softly, tears pricking my eyes. "I did. Thank you for truly seeing him." That exact night, I did something completely out of character. I took out my phone. I only had about 200 followers, mostly old college friends and freelance clients. But as the Mediterranean sun sank, painting the water spun gold, Mason wrapped his strong arms around my waist from behind. He rested his chin on my shoulder, smiling genuinely. I didn't just want a photo to make Rebecca laugh. I wanted a permanent record of my survival. I snapped a quick selfie, me in my flowing white dress, him holding me close. In the corner of the frame sat the thick Camden Gallery exhibition catalog with Mason's bold name printed on the cover, right next to a sweating glass of expensive champagne. My caption took 10 seconds to type: "Honeymooning with my brilliant husband, endlessly grateful for the people who actually showed up." I didn't tag a single relative. I didn't add dramatic, angry hashtags. I just posted the pure truth, tossed my phone into the bedside drawer, and fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep of my entire life. The next morning, I woke up to the gentle rocking of the ocean. Out of pure habit, I reached into the drawer. The glowing screen was a terrifying wall of frantic notifications. I had to scroll for an entire minute just to reach the very bottom. 503 missed calls and desperate text messages. 503. Let that staggering number sink into your bones. The exact same blood relatives who couldn't be bothered to type congratulations on my wedding day suddenly had endless things to say when they saw the sparkling deck of a billionaire's mega yacht. Before I could even read the panicked words, a frantic, heavy knock shattered our peaceful morning. The sweaty Maltese dockmaster stood gasping in our doorway, gripping a heavy, waterproof satellite phone. "Signora, a frantic American named Blake Winchester is calling the marina's direct emergency line. He claims it is a life-or-death financial crisis and he absolutely must speak to your husband right now." I stared coldly at the blinking device. Blake, the arrogant golden boy who had actively ignored my existence for 4 solid years, had somehow tracked a private vessel across the Mediterranean Sea just to beg the starving artist for a lifeline. I looked the dockmaster dead in the eye, my voice as calm and freezing as winter ice. Tell him he has the wrong number. I firmly disconnected the line, leaving my desperate brother-in-law to drown in his own making, but the tidal wave of toxic messages waiting on my own glowing screen was about to force me to confront the family that threw me away. I sat on the edge of the massive plush bed, scrolling through the endless wall of messages. I read them clinically, slowly, the way a doctor reads a tragic autopsy report, letting every single blow land. My father, 27 missed calls, 14 frantic text messages. His very first thought wasn't an apology. It was, "Abigail, whose yacht is that?" Then, "Call me back right now." Then, "I didn't know Mason was doing this well. Why didn't you tell us?" And finally, at 3 in the morning his time, "Honey, please call your dad. You only remember I'm your daughter when there's a price tag attached." My mother, 21 calls, 12 texts, "Oh my God, Abigail," followed closely by, "Is that Malta? Then, are you okay? Whose boat is that?" And inevitably the ultimate fake olive branch, "I'm so incredibly happy for you, sweetheart. We need to celebrate when you get back." Celebrate. You want to throw a party for the yacht, not the bride you abandoned. Chloe 8 calls, which was remarkably restrained by her dramatic standards. 4 messages, each one exposing her raw panic. Wait, what? Then, is Mason's art actually selling? And finally, the desperate command, "Abigail, we should talk. Call me." The perfect golden kingdom is crashing down and the queen is terrified. The rest of the screen was a flood of distant aunts, uncles, and forgotten cousins. "OMG, congratulations. So incredibly proud of you guys. We always knew Mason was secretly talented." The exact same relatives who aggressively RSVP'd no to my wedding were now fighting to stand in the front row of our new success. And then at the very bottom sat a message I truly never expected. Blake Winchester. He had never texted me directly before in his entire life. "Abigail, is your husband currently represented by a gallery? I have clients. I'd love to connect." The arrogant man whose wallet had bought my family's total loyalty was now trying to network through the sister-in-law he treated like dirt for 4 years. I read every single word. I did not type a single reply. Mason found me standing on the sunny balcony an hour later. My phone sat face down on the glass table. He didn't ask what the frantic messages said. He could read the heavy exhaustion in my eyes. "I'm not going to ignore them forever," I whispered to the ocean wind. "But I absolutely refuse to pretend this is okay." That afternoon, I unlocked the Prescott family group chat for the first time since my wedding day. I typed one clear message. I revised the words twice to strip away all the anger, leaving only cold, hard truth. "Thank you all for your sudden messages. Mason and I are doing wonderfully." For those aggressively curious, Mason signed a major art commission 8 weeks ago. The yacht belongs to his private patron. Our honeymoon was a generous gift. But I want to be entirely honest. I will not pretend that your absolute absence on May 12th didn't destroy me. It did. Dad, you promised to walk me down the aisle and chose not to. Mom, you chose a country club over your youngest daughter's vows. Chloe, you scheduled your event on my date deliberately to force a choice. I am not angry anymore, but I need permanent space. When I am ready to speak, I will reach out. Please respect that boundary. I hit send. Then I shoved the phone back into the dark drawer. For 5 solid hours, nobody dared to reply. I pictured them gathering in a panicked cluster around a kitchen island, passing the glowing screen back and forth, staring at each other in the sick, heavy silence of people who have finally been caught. My father called right at 9 o'clock that night. I let it ring. An hour later, Chloe launched her pathetic counterattack. She posted an Instagram story, a glossy photo of a beautifully set dinner table in Georgetown. Warm lighting bouncing off expensive wine glasses. Her typed caption read, "Family dinner tonight. Missing one, as though I had simply forgotten to show up, as though I was the ungrateful one who walked away. Some people will fiercely rewrite the script, even when the entire audience already knows they are lying. 4 weeks after we flew home from Malta, the prestigious Camden Gallery officially issued their press release. Mason Donovan, the 9th chair, solo exhibition. It blasted out to every major art publication in the country. Art in America ran a massive preview. Artsy picked the story up that exact same afternoon, and then came the absolute crown jewel, a massive feature in the Washington Post Arts section. The article included a breathtaking, high-resolution photograph of Mason standing proudly beside the emotional centerpiece of his show, the painting. A breezy garden rendered in luminous golden afternoon light. An arch built of salvaged wood, threaded with soft eucalyptus. 48 crisp white chairs stretching across a bright green lawn. Just 9 of those seats held human figures, painted with the fierce, glowing tenderness Mason reserves only for the people he truly loves. The other 39 chairs were completely, agonizingly empty. Sunlight fell across the vacant seats like a brutal question nobody wanted to answer. The title of the piece was printed below the photo. May 12th. The listed price, $135,000. It was already sold. Vincent Atwood claimed it weeks before the gallery doors even opened. The journalist noted that Mason's stunning work explored familial abandonment and emotional displacement with a raw specificity that feels both deeply personal and universally devastating. On opening night, 250 elite guests packed the Manhattan Gallery. Wealthy collectors, famous curators, ruthless critics. I stood quietly beside Mason in a simple black dress, watching total strangers openly weep in front of painted canvases that were born from the absolute worst day of my life. Suddenly, the thick crowd parted. Julian Vance, the most notoriously vicious art critic on the East Coast, stepped firmly in front of the May 12th painting. He openly scoffed, his cruel voice carrying loudly over the live string quartet. "A bit melodramatic, isn't it?" Julian sneered, turning his sharp eyes toward Mason. "Fabricated trauma designed for cheap commercial sympathy. Honestly, who actually hosts a wedding with 39 empty chairs?" Mason didn't blink. He didn't back down. He stepped right up to the famous critic, his deep voice slicing cleanly through the gallery's sudden, breathless silence. "I do," Mason answered, "because my bride's father chose to eat finger sandwiches at a country club over giving his own daughter away." Julian's smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished. All the color violently drained from his pale face. He slowly turned his head back to the massive painting, finally seeing the real, devastating heartbreak locked inside the heavy brushstrokes. The ruthless critic didn't write a mocking review that night. The next morning, he published a front-page confession of his own absolute awe. A reporter from the Post had rushed up to Mason right after the confrontation. The title, May 12th. Is it truly autobiographical? Mason didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. Yes, it was my wedding day. 9 guests, 48 chairs. The crowded room went dead quiet. Then a million frantic questions began. By sunrise, our painful story was literally everywhere. I hadn't planned it. Mason never planned it. But the raw truth, once it finally finds a microphone, doesn't ever ask for permission to speak. My father saw the viral article first. I never found out who forwarded the link to him, but I can easily picture him sitting at the Georgetown kitchen table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, staring blankly at his iPad, seeing those 48 chairs rendered in thick oil paint with the agonizing precision of a man who remembers every single detail of the day his father-in-law refused to show up. My mother called me frantically. Her voice cracked in a jagged, terrifying way I had never heard before. "Abigail, your father saw the painting online. He hasn't spoken a single word in 4 hours. He just sits there staring at the wall." "Mom, I didn't paint it," I replied calmly. "Mason did. He just painted what actually happened." She didn't have a single excuse left for that. Chloe's reaction was entirely different. She wasn't heartbroken. She was absolutely furious. Not at herself, but at the sudden public exposure. Within days, her wealthy social circle began asking uncomfortable questions. "Wait, your sister's husband is the famous Mason Donovan? Why weren't you in the wedding photos?" Chloe, who had spent years carefully curating a fake narrative of perfect family unity, suddenly couldn't explain the massive, glaring gap. Her flawless image had a 39-chair-sized hole blasted right through it. Even Blake tried to call Mason directly, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "Hey Mason, huge congratulations, man. Listen, I have some elite clients who might be interested in commissioning a piece." Mason cut him off smoothly, politely, and lethally. "Thanks, Blake, but I work exclusively through my gallery now. Henry and Camden handle all my high-end commissions." Click. Meanwhile, Aunt Penelope secretly sent me one last screenshot from the family group chat. Chloe had frantically typed, "She is doing this on purpose just to humiliate us." And my father, for the very first time in his entire cowardly life, replied to the group, "Maybe we should have just gone to the wedding." My mother's instant, chilling response, "Don't start, Robert." Even now, with their ugly betrayal hanging on a literal museum wall for the whole world to cry over, they still couldn't choke out the one simple sentence I needed to hear. But a devastating legal document was about to hit the public records, and it would expose my sister's darkest, sickest secret of all. 3 months after the breathtaking exhibition opened, a quiet legal notice appeared in the Delaware Business Registry. To most people, it was just a boring, forgettable paragraph. But to me, It was an earthquake. Winchester Properties LLC, Blake's untouchable family empire, had officially filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy protection. The ugly details bled out slowly, then all at once like a cracking dam. 2 massive development projects in Springfield had totally collapsed. A heavy construction loan went into default. Angry creditors were lining up at the courthouse doors. The company that had once crowned Blake the golden, flawless son-in-law of the Prescott family was now just a disgraced name on a tragic court filing. And then, the absolute sickest, ugliest truth of all violently spilled out in the public financial records. Chloe's extravagant, over-the-top baby shower, it was never actually about celebrating a baby. It was a desperate, panicked PR stunt. Blake's company was already drowning in massive debt by May, and they hosted that lavish shower to project an illusion of bulletproof wealth to the nervous investors sitting on the guest list. Chloe had stolen my wedding day, hijacked my art, and forced my parents to abandon me, all to use her own family as cheap, smiling props in a fraudulent networking event. The brutal consequences hit my parents within weeks. Blake stopped paying the heavy mortgage on the Georgetown house. $3,800 a month vanished into thin air overnight. My mother's shiny supplementary credit card was brutally declined at the grocery store checkout. Chloe, who had never needed to check a price tag in her entire adult life, began desperately selling her jewelry through a luxury online consignment site. The diamond Chopard bracelet, a heavy Tiffany pendant, precious pieces she had once paraded around like royal trophies. My father called me. It was the very first time I heard his voice since the newspaper article dropped. "Abigail, I don't know how to say this." His tone was incredibly thin, scraping like dry leaves on concrete. "Your mother and we might actually lose the house. I know I have absolutely no right to ask, but is there any way?" I let the heavy silence sit between us. I think he desperately needed to hear it. It was the exact same, suffocating silence I heard on my wedding morning when he casually told me he wasn't coming. "Dad," I answered, my voice perfectly even. "I'm going to be completely honest with you. 5 months ago you chose Chloe's fake party over my real wedding. You broke a sacred promise. You let me walk down that long aisle with our landlord because showing up for me wasn't worth the highway drive." I heard his ragged breathing echoing through the speaker. "I'm not going to say a hard no to helping you survive, but I need you to understand something permanently. I am not your backup plan. I am your daughter, and you treated me like I was completely optional." He didn't speak for a very long time. Then, quietly, "You're right. It wasn't nearly enough to heal the wound, but it was a tiny start." Chloe called exactly 4 days later. It was the very first time we'd spoken since before I put on my ivory lace dress. She opened with sickening, practiced tenderness. "I miss you so much, Abby." The childish nickname, the sweet, breathy tone she always deployed when she wanted a favor. Then, within 45 seconds, the heavy mask violently slipped off. "Blake lost everything. Mom and Dad need serious help. You and Mason are doing so incredibly well now. Can't we just move past this silly feud?" "Move past what, exactly?" I kept my voice fiercely grounded. Not cold, just razor clear. "You scheduled your fake baby shower on my wedding day. You systematically called every single family member and commanded them to choose you. You told Dad that I could have a wedding anytime because I was used to being disappointed. Do you remember typing that?" Dead silence on her end. Then the defensive venom leaked out. "I was pregnant, Abigail. I was hormonal and terrified, and you were just being calculating." I stated it without an ounce of malice, just cold fact. "And that's okay, I'm not here to punish you. But I need you to know I see it clearly now. I've always seen the manipulation. I just chose to ignore it because I desperately wanted a loving family." I could hear her panicked breathing change, the practiced, socialite calm completely faltering. "I love you, Chloe, but I will never again let your version of love be used as a leash around my neck. If you ever want a real relationship with me, it starts with absolute honesty, not with begging for my husband's money." She slammed the phone down. She didn't call back for 4 solid weeks. I set the receiver down and walked quietly into the studio, where Mason was finishing the 10th masterpiece in his series. A long dining table with 13 place settings, 1 single wooden chair pulled back, a white cloth napkin folded but forever untouched. He looked up when I walked in. "How'd it go?" She hung up. He nodded wisely. "She'll call back." "Maybe, but she'll call back different. Or she won't call back at all. Those are the only 2 options I'm accepting." Mason went right back to painting. I picked up my favorite illustration pen. The crickets sang loudly outside the window, completely indifferent to the human drama. 8 months later, I stood barefoot in the warm kitchen of a beautiful house I actually owned. It was small, a cozy 2-bedroom cottage in Wilmington, Delaware, just 15 minutes from the crashing waves. White clapboard, sky blue shutters, a wide wooden porch that wrapped entirely around the side. The entire ground floor had been transformed into Mason's dream studio, proper ceiling ventilation, massive north-facing windows for natural light, a heavy door that opened straight onto a lush garden where I planned to grow purple lavender in the spring. We had paid for it in full. No crushing mortgage, no financial help from anyone, no rich brother-in-law holding a threat over our heads, just our names printed firmly on the crisp deed. Mason had successfully completed the 9th chair series, 15 breathtaking paintings that hung proudly in the Camden Gallery for 4 glorious months. Nearly every single piece sold to private collectors. Total revenue massively exceeded $750,000, and the desperate waiting list for his next upcoming series was already miles long. Vincent Atwood had instantly offered a second, highly lucrative commission. 2 elite European galleries had already reached out. My own quiet career had magically shifted too. A major, renowned children's book publisher offered me a multi-book illustration contract after an art director spotted my unique editorial style at the Camden opening. The very first book was about a brave little girl who plants a wild garden of colorful flowers in a barren dirt field where absolutely nothing was supposed to grow. I was sketching it at our oak dining room table every single morning, while Mason happily worked downstairs. Henry came over for Sunday dinner every single week. He would drive his beat-up old Volvo down from Newport, bringing a bottle of dry red wine, nothing crazy expensive, but always perfectly aged, and sit at our table like he had belonged there his entire life, because in every single way that truly mattered, he absolutely did. One breezy Sunday, I served a hot roast chicken seasoned with fresh herbs picked from our own garden. Henry raised his crystal glass to the 9th chair. Mason gently clinked his glass against Henry's. I clinked mine against both of theirs. 9 loyal people at a wedding, and every single one of them still standing firmly by our side. On a crisp, windy Wednesday afternoon in late October, I heard tires crunch heavily onto our gravel driveway. Nobody had called ahead. I curiously opened the front door and found my father standing awkwardly on the wooden porch. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt and wrinkled khakis. His trembling hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He looked so much older than I remembered, not just in the natural way of time passing, but in the tragic way of a man who had been carrying something incredibly heavy and couldn't figure out how to set it down. "I didn't come here to ask for a single penny," he stated softly. I waited, leaning against the doorframe. "I came to tell you that I am so deeply sorry. Not the cheap kind of sorry that expects instant forgiveness. The real kind that absolutely knows it doesn't deserve it." He stood there shivering in the golden October light, dry autumn leaves drifting across the porch boards. And I could clearly see he had anxiously rehearsed this speech. Not because it was fake, but because it was terrifyingly genuine. He desperately needed to get the words exactly right. "I sat in a fancy country club eating tiny finger sandwiches while my youngest daughter got married with only 9 people," he choked out, his eyes filling with tears. "I will carry that sickening shame for the rest of my natural life." "I know, Dad." My voice was remarkably steady, incredibly quiet. "You can come inside. You can stay for coffee. Mason just brewed a fresh pot." He stepped over the threshold. He walked incredibly slowly through our warm house, looking at absolutely everything in quiet awe. The sprawling studio downstairs, the sunlit garden visible through the back window, Mason's magnificent paintings hanging proudly on the walls. In the narrow hallway, he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. A small, framed painting hung near the brass coat hooks. May 12th. Study number 1, an early rough sketch in oil. 9 chairs occupied. 39 completely empty. My father stood frozen in front of it for a very long time, his shoulders shaking. Then he reached into a battered canvas bag he was carrying and pulled out a dusty wooden frame. Inside sat a thick piece of paper. The Delaware Regional Art Award, dated 14 long years ago. My name printed boldly on the front. The edges had severely yellowed with age. "I found it hidden up in the attic," he whispered, wiping his eyes. "It should have been proudly displayed on the living room wall 18 years ago." I reached out and took it from his shaking hands, and I let him stay for that cup of coffee. People always ask me in the comments, "Did you fully forgive them?" The honest, messy truth is that forgiveness is never a single, magical event. It's not a neatly wrapped gift you hand over and then the pain is permanently gone. It is a fragile bridge you have to build, one heavy wooden plank at a time, and some mornings you are bravely laying down fresh planks, and other days you are just standing paralyzed at the very edge, wondering if the other side is even worth crossing. Chloe eventually wrote me a letter, a real one, blue pen on lined paper, actually mailed with a postage stamp. It wasn't a flawless, perfect apology, but it contained the one raw sentence I had been desperately waiting years to hear. I scheduled the shower on your special day on purpose. It wasn't an accident. I was terrified that if your wedding went beautifully, Mom and Dad would finally stop needing me. I read that tragic line 5 times, then I folded the paper and tucked it safely into my desk drawer. Not aggressively in the trash, not framed on the wall, just in the drawer, where I could eventually find it when my heart was completely ready. My mother faithfully calls me once a week now. She actually asks about my drawing deadlines, about Mason's upcoming gallery shows, about the blooming garden. She never asks for a single dime. It's a remarkably small thing, but it's a true one. Blake and Chloe live in a cramped rented apartment in Springfield now. Blake swallowed his massive pride and took a junior position at a rival firm, starting completely over from the bottom. Chloe surprisingly got a job, her very first actual paycheck in 7 years, working as a low-level events coordinator for a local nonprofit. I heard through the grapevine she's surprisingly good at it. I genuinely hope she is. And me? I'm standing peacefully on the back porch of a beautiful house I paid for with my own hard work, watching the fading evening light settle gently over the wild garden. Mason is downstairs in the studio. I can hear the soft, rhythmic scrape of his steel palette knife drifting through the open window. Henry is already on his way over for Sunday dinner. The vibrant purple lavender I planted in the damp spring soil has finally started to bloom. 48 rented chairs, 9 loyal people, 503 panicked messages. In the very end, the stressful numbers simply don't matter anymore. What truly matters is that I finally stopped counting the toxic people who cowardly walked away, and I started cherishing the fierce ones who bravely stayed. Self-respect is the absolute quietest form of revenge. You don't ever have to aggressively burn anything down. You just have to permanently stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. If this deeply personal story stayed with you today, if you've ever been the broken one sitting alone in the empty chairs while someone else selfishly demanded the full room, I see you. You are not invisible. You never were. Your true worth does not depend on their applause. There is a quiet, healing power in bringing these hidden truths into the light. If the raw depth and intensity of this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to build your own bridge out of heartbreak, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Staying connected means you'll always have a place here for more stories that honor the messy, beautiful reality of choosing yourself. And before you leave, I have one final question. Would you have answered those 503 frantic calls, or would you have kept the phone locked safely in the drawer? Drop your honest answer in the comments. I promise I'll be reading every single one.